Hello, this is Swazwo from Udaipur, and today I have a very special guest in town. This is Christopher Pinney, who I've known for, I don't know, since 2006 or 7 at least. Long time. Long time. He wrote the preface for Photowala very nicely, but he is the author of numerous books on photography and art. He specializes in vernacular art, I would say. You may want to correct me, and we have some of his books here. The Waterless Sea, which is a beautiful book about mirages. And this one, these are just two I happen to have out. Lessons from Hell, which is about Carney Barney paintings, which is a wonderful book, so I'm going to give that a plug right away. Anyway, Christopher, nice to have you in Udaipur.
Great to be here.
What are we talking about today? I'll let you pick the subject.
Well, maybe we could start with a brief outline of a project I'm currently working on, which is a European Research Council funded investigation into vernacular photography and politics, the title of which is Citizens of Photography. Okay. So I've just come from another 10 days in Nagda in Madhya Pradesh, doing largely rural field work in the village that features in camera indica.
Yeah, Nagda is kind of your second home. It's like my Udaipur, I think.
Yes,
really love Nagda.
I think Udaipur is a lot easier to love than
Nagda's pretty small, right?
Yeah, it's 125,000 people.
Okay.
So it's a booming industrial small town. I mean, technically a city, a Nagapalika. People who live in Nagda are incredibly attached to it, and you can easily... I was thinking just the other night, walking through the bazaar and being hailed by various people sitting out in front of their shops, who I've seen sitting out in front of those same shops for 20, 30 years, that the familiarity of it becomes incredibly appealing, I think, to that.
You have a lot of friends and acquaintances there, right?
Yeah.
A lot of people who know you.
Yeah, but one can also start to see how, although environmentally it may be unappealing in terms of sociality and the sense of community, it exerts an incredibly strong pull on people. So during those 10 days I was mostly working in my old village, which is 6 kilometers away from the town.
Okay.
And in search of interesting photographs, old and current, that might
You like to discover undiscovered archives. Can I phrase it that way?
Yeah, that's a great way of
you have a book of an undiscovered archive, and the name I'm forgetting. You might
yes, what is it called? Artisan Camera.
Artisan Camera, great book.
Based on Studio Suag's 120 negative archive, which they were about to throw away after it had been damaged in the monsoon.
Oh no.
And this being myself and my younger son Thomas, managed to spend a week on our hands and knees trying to sort out salvageable negatives, of which I suppose...
And some of those images were just incredible, and what I loved about it is it wasn't just the shot of the backdrop and the model, but it was pulled back far enough that you could see the lighting and everything else, the whole environment of making the shoot. That's what I really liked about it.
Yeah, it was like the sort of pure physics of medium format photography.
Right.
So predicated on the desire or the need to get a full body within a square frame.
And the way the models wanted to like present themselves to the camera, you know, with the Bollywood look or whatever. But I mean, they had props and things at the
Yes.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, jackets, ties, dark glasses, plastic drapes, guitars.
Oh, I still have all kinds of people who want to wear dark glasses when I photograph them today. The Bollywood look.
Yeah, well, a sign of sophistication and of not having to return.
So I'm just going to distract you a little bit, but you used the word vernacular, so does Annapurna Garamella uses vernacular a lot. How do you define vernacular, I guess? And the reason I bring it up, when we had a book launch in Mumbai one time, who was it? I'm forgetting her name right now. But she had a real issue with the word vernacular, and she said, why are you not using the term subaltern rather than vernacular? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I think she has a point. I mean, I'm tending towards the term demotic currently rather than vernacular. So I don't have any huge ideological objection to vernacular, but I have a kind of minor theoretical critique of it. And I think that one of the reasons that perhaps one should use demotic rather than vernacular is that vernacular essentially comes out of linguistic theory. Okay. So it assumes there are overarching languages, Latin, Sanskrit, that then devolve, that are then vernacularized into smaller regional
And so
practices.
What's the nuance with demotic?
Well, just before I come to that, I think that, so vernacular actually describes what Pierre Bourdieu, in a very influential book, Photography, a Middlebrow Art, describes. So that's essentially a top-down view that there are dominant photographic practices, the equivalent of Latin or Sanskrit, against which or out of which these more local practices precipitate. And I think historically that doesn't really work in the context of photographic production. So demotic, I think, has much more of a sense of subaltern or bottom-up commonality. So what I think one sees in demotic photography are not practices born out of a conflict or negotiation with dominant practices, but ground level practices which have a lot in common with each other. So I mean, one of the slogans I like to throw about is more than local, less than global. So I think that demotic photographic practices occupy that space.
I remembered the name now. It was Nancy Adajania. She was the one who asked this question of Annapurna. Why are you using the term vernacular rather than subaltern? So then how would you describe the difference between subaltern and vernacular?
Well, I think they would both share a sense that they've been generated from the bottom up autonomously, not necessarily out of intimate dialogue or contestation with dominant practices. So I think it points to their autonomy. Subaltern obviously has a more politicized nuance to it. Demotic makes more sense in the context of thinking about an alternative within
That's the way I was
theory.
reading it. I was reading the subaltern is talking about class structure more, and vernacular is more talking about the existence of a form.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's where
because
my
vernacular can be middle class, vernacular can be upper middle class.
Yeah. But that's where I think my interest in photography overlaps with my earlier work, well, and ongoing work on popular print culture. So one of the kind of defining moments in my thinking about largely Hindu popular visual culture, that most of which was published in a book called Photos of the Gods, was a moment where I was in a newsagent's in King's Cross in London and looked up at this rack of magazines and suddenly had the sense that there were dozens of faces staring at me, rather in the style that one encounters on a roadside stall in India where you're looking at the gods. So I was struck there by this, I suppose, improbable conjunction, disjunction, I mean a similarity between these two very different cultural locations. And so I think a lot of my interest has been how one gets out of that sort of space of cultural particularity whilst also respecting local cultural nuance.
So how have you...
But try... Go on.
Am I interrupting you?
No.
Too much. So how have you gone from your interest in the vernacular to writing about people like me and Shiva and Pushpamala? Because you also have wandered into, you have forayed into the realm of contemporary photography as well. And why is that?
Yeah, good question. Well, I suppose with Pushpamala, that was an easy voyage because so much of her work borrows from, pays a kind of critical homage to that popular visual culture. So that was an easy transition. In your case, I think I was more interested in theoretical questions about different temporalities, different life worlds, which I think is implicit in, certainly in Pushpamala's early work, the Phantom Lady series in particular, which I always thought was really about, and this is partly taking up a cue from Madhav Prasad's writing on that project, but I always thought that was primarily involved or engaged with investigating different times rather than different identities or different faces. And I think that was one aspect that appealed to me in your work, that it opened up the past. I mean, I, in thinking about your work, drew on Ashish Nandi's work on the kind of non-official past, how one desynchronizes.
And Kap Shiva, how did you relate to Kap Shiva?
Well, Kap Shiva, I think, is intrinsically performative and theatrical. I mean, you know, his work is basically all about a studio aesthetic in the absence of a studio, I think. So it feels very accessible, it feels very readable, very familiar. So my sense is that he's patrolling Bangalore and elsewhere, looking for these theatrical settings that are already a studio in the street.
Right. But I really distracted you from the original point you wanted to discuss. So why don't we get back to that?
Yeah, so that was really just focusing on this question of the local, the global, what sort of cultural space one's dealing with, which one could call subaltern, demotic, but I think what's at stake there is to say that it's not focusing on peculiarly Indian practices or peculiarly African practices. What I think is interesting is where you get these resonances between differently spatially located practices which seem to share a huge amount in common. So I think that's one way of approaching the demotic. It exceeds locality, but it falls far short of becoming a global aesthetic, because there are dominant aesthetics, art world and otherwise, that are completely different. But it then means that one's, studying popular visual culture in India becomes not a way of, as Ron Inden would put it, of digging a deep hole that becomes more and more Indian, but of empirically grounding one's study of the phenomenon with a view to then making connections with practices elsewhere. So I think you were also touching on the fact that my method is deeply empirical. It's based on anthropological fieldwork.
That's one of your books, Photography and Anthropology, or Anthropology and Photography, I forget the order, but...
Yeah, Photography and Anthropology, yes. Right. Yeah, so I was trained in social anthropology, and my PhD thesis is on Indian industrial workers in a big Grasim viscose rayon plant in Nagda. So the original reason for going to Nagda was to study industrial work patterns, time regimes. So I went there with a completely different project, spent 15 months there, mostly living in the village, and was seduced by the aesthetic of what's sometimes called calendar art, i.e. the images that these industrial workers had hanging on their walls.
People compare some of my own photographs to calendar art, and I've never really been attracted to calendar art. And I go like, why are you comparing it to calendar art? But I guess they see it with that new myth series with the Hanuman and the Krishna. So there was a connection with that series, possibly, but I don't see it as a whole. But anyway, that's it.
Well, my own experience with calendar art was that it exerted its compulsion over me, so that when I was writing up the thesis back in the UK, I kind of felt this void of needing to see more examples of calendar art and to ecstatically immerse myself in their voluptuous colours. So it is something like an addiction, I think.
What do you think about, and this is just a question off the top of my head, the relationship between anthropology and nostalgia, I mean, and also photography, because some of these interests arise because there's sort of a fear that things will change and that these things will be lost to history. So, you know, there's a fear that calendar art will change. It will be so contemporarized, if I'm saying that right, that it will no longer be recognizable as what we know it now or what we knew it to be 10 years ago. Do you think that's a part of your practice? Is that something underneath it, or?
Yeah, I think one couldn't deny that there is some element of salvage in the whole thing.
Right.
I mean, complementing that, I would say that I think what's so endlessly fascinating about photography is that it's necessarily a work in progress. I mean, we still don't know what photography is, what it's capable of. It's endless. It has always been endlessly transforming into new devices, into new practices. 3 of the images I collected just recently in Nagda I thought worked rather interestingly together, and they came from one studio, and one of them was from about 30 years ago and showed the studio proprietor in a self-portrait using a conventional desk phone and reading a newspaper. And so this is at a time when there weren't really phones that were connected to the network in Nagda. Phones were in studios as props. So it was about being...
was a luxury.
Yeah, it was about being modern, about being connected. So you were connected on the phone, you were connected to the world through the newspaper. The next photograph I thought would make an interesting juxtaposition with it was of a 2-year-old boy photographed in the studio just recently holding a mobile phone, presumably one of its parents. So that was a new version of wanting to be modern, of aspiring to command technology. But it also had the kind of poison of new technology in it, because of course one of the huge problems that many studios face is that mobile phone photography is replacing many of the functions of a studio. So I thought it was intriguing to see the mobile phone brought in.
I might be wrong, but I think Dayanida Singh basically thinks photography is dead now at this point. She says she calls herself a bookmaker now. She's a bookmaker. She's no longer a photographer. She's been quoted as saying that at any rate.
Yeah, but if one's studying demotic practices, I mean, they're booming like never before. So the third image then I thought would go in this triptych of endlessly transforming photography was a printout of a selfie of 2 Nagda girls, obviously taken on their own phone, which they brought into the studio to have printed. Okay. So if one put those 3 images together in a frame, it would give you a 40-year history and a history of the past, but also a kind of prophecy of the future, I think, in a fascinating way. And it would tell you a lot about the difficulties of trying to define photography, because it's endlessly mutating through those different devices.
Well, to me, the death of photography has been heralded so many times. It's never really died yet, has it? It's just expanded and expanded, so I don't give that any credence whatsoever. I think the definition of fine art photography will probably change, already has many times, but I don't think it will die.
But coming back to the nostalgia point, there's a strange satisfaction in salvaging an archive and recovering the past. And
well, people get critical of the idea of nostalgia, but nostalgia is a sentiment, which we're not really talking about, I guess. But it's part of what drives us to know and hold on to and cherish and want to preserve the past, because it's part of that knowledge that we form of where did we come from. And knowing where we came from is a big part of knowing where we are and where we might want to go in the future. So to me, it's like, well, you can't cut yourself off from the past. That's knowing your history. And doing anthropology, doing archaeology, all of these things, making an archive, is knowing the minutia of history. So when people make broad claims about history, if you want, you can go back and dig things out and say, no, that's not really true. There were these exceptions. Am I right?
Sure. I mean, I think the other thing in an Indian, or that's particularly acute in an Indian context, is what one could call a recursive archive. So, I mean, one of the things that I dwelt on in writing about so-called calendar art was the fact that the major archives of past images and future potential images were held by artists. So when they got commissions from publishers, which might be, we want a new design for Kali with XYZ, they would go into their often very vast archives of earlier images and select potential prototypes. And these archives contained images that in some cases went back 120 years. So none of the archive was sedimented, none of it had died. It was all still potentially a live solution to a present and future problem. So you had this recursive churning of the past into the present, and I think that's a very strong feature of it's happening now in the commercial picture printing industry, because many companies are buying back the original gouaches of the works they commissioned and then photoshopping those in endless ongoing pastiches. So the past is always there as a fragment, I mean often as a template, and it's difficult to eradicate, it's difficult to sediment it and get it to go to sleep.
So this is getting a little long, I think. We're probably getting close to our 20 minutes. Are you working on a new book?
Well, the major focus is this project, Citizens of Photography. So
that will be a book then.
Yeah, that's going to be, it's going to result in at least 2 books. So one of it's going to be on photography in Nepal, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and certain parts of India. So that's
intended. This is a joint project between you and
that's part of a joint project. So I'm doing all the field work for those bits of South Asia, which is why I've been travelling so much recently. And there are 5 other people on the project who are working in different parts of the world. But the other outcome associated with the project will be a new updated edition of Camera Indica. So that came out in '97.
Camera Indica is a classic.
That's
so how I got to know you, was through Camera Indica, because Hemant Sharma pushed that into my hand and said, don't you have this book? So.
Right, well, so much has happened since '97. So I want to do an updated, essentially ethnographic
Carney Barney, this is one of my favorites though. I really like this book. Put out by Mar.
Very gracious.
So you should buy this. Christopher feels it should get wider distribution, I think, according to a Facebook comment he made. And so it has an RVJ,
yes,
an RVJ on the back cover too.
Yeah.
There's a, ulterior motive for
it's
me
greatly
pushing
enhanced
this book.
by the back cover.
But every time I look at this book and I see these pictures, I am reminded not to be as naughty and sinful as I am. Not to be so evil.
Well, I mean, that's just the ostensible purpose of them, but as I also try and argue that one of the reasons the images are so compelling and fascinating is that I think they also have the opposite effect. There's a certain allure.
Oh, look what they're doing there in hell.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, hell seems like a pretty interesting
Yeah,
place.
so there's a kind of slippery, contagious mimesis
Right.
at work. So I think there's a profound lesson about mimesis to be had from studying these images.
Okay, I'm going to cut this off. Thank you, Christopher,
Pleasure.
for
Very
having our time
welcome.
in Udaipur. I hope the mic worked.
Yeah.
And goodbye, everybody from Udaipur, from Wasvo, and Christopher Pinney.